It was Thanksgiving night, and I was driving home after spending the day with my family. I was tired but content, carrying the warmth of laughter and conversations shared around the table. The road was quiet, with only a few cars passing by. It was almost midnight, and the sky was dark except for the twinkling stars. The radio played softly in the background, a song I barely noticed as my thoughts drifted between the day's memories and the comfort of finally getting home. That's when I noticed the car. It was a black sedan, nothing flashy, but it seemed to stay at the same distance from me, no matter how much I sped up or slowed down. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, maybe someone heading in the same direction. But the way it maintained an exact distance began to make me uneasy. I turned right onto a smaller road to see if it would follow me, and sure enough, it did. My heart started to race. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just paranoia. But as the minutes passed and the car stayed behind me, the unease grew stronger. As I got closer to home, the car remained behind me, and the tension became unbearable. My mind raced to find logical explanations. Maybe it's just a coincidence, I thought, but every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, the black sedan was still there, keeping the same exact distance. To test it further, I slowed down almost to a stop on a deserted street. It did the same. That's when the fear truly set in. My hands started to sweat, and my heart pounded so loudly it echoed in the quiet car. I knew I was close to home, but I hesitated. I didn't want them to know where I lived. Despite the fear, I didn't see another option. I pulled through the gate and parked in the driveway as quickly as I could, locking the car doors the moment I turned off the engine. Through the rearview mirror, I saw the sedan stop at the corner. It wasn't a casual stop. It stayed there, headlights off, clearly watching my house. Shaking, I ran inside and locked the door behind me. Peeking through the living room curtains, I saw the car still there. My heart raced again as I realized the silhouette of someone inside seemed to be turned toward my house. Inside, I tried to calm myself, but the fear was overwhelming. I kept peeking out the window, trying to figure out what the driver wanted. They didn't get out of the car or make any overtly suspicious moves, but just the fact that they were sitting there, parked on the corner, was terrifying enough. I grabbed my phone and thought about calling the police, but hesitated. What would I even say? There's a car parked near my house? Sounded so trivial, but something in my gut told me this wasn't normal. I decided to call my best friend, who lived in the same town, to tell her what was happening. She listened quietly and, sensing the panic in my voice, said, "Call the police now. It doesn't matter if it feels like an overreaction." As I dialed, the situation outside remained unchanged. The car sat there, motionless, as if the driver was waiting for something. Finally, the police answered, and I explained the situation, my voice trembling. They said they'd send a patrol car, but it might take a few minutes. Those minutes felt like hours as I stayed by the window, keeping the lights off to avoid drawing attention. Suddenly, the car's headlights turned on, and it began to move slowly down the street. My heart raced again as I tried to guess their intentions. The car stopped briefly in front of my house, and for a moment, I thought the driver might get out. But then, they sped up and disappeared around the corner. Even though the car was gone, I couldn't relax. I stood in the living room, staring out the window, expecting it to reappear at any moment. A few minutes later, flashing lights from a police car illuminated the street, bringing a fleeting sense of relief. 2 officers approached and knocked on the door. I explained everything, from the moment I noticed the car following me to it stopping on the corner. They took my account seriously, which reassured me, but they didn't find the car or any signs of suspicious activity in the neighborhood. One of the officers advised me to stay cautious over the next few days, checking locks and paying attention to anything unusual. Sometimes people do this to scope out houses or test how residents react, he explained, which only made me feel more uneasy. Before leaving, the officers patrolled the area again but found nothing. When I returned inside, the silence felt heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath with me. Even though I tried to convince myself the danger had passed, I knew I wouldn't sleep that night. The night dragged on, each creak of the house sounding louder and more ominous than usual. I stayed on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, trying to keep my eyes open until dawn. As soon as the sun rose, I went outside to check the front of the house. Nothing seemed out of place, but the lingering feeling of vulnerability was overwhelming. I called my friend again and asked her to come over. When she arrived, it brought some comfort, but she also urged me to take extra precautions. "You don't know who that person was or what they wanted," she said, reinforcing the pit in my stomach. In the days that followed, I became hyper-aware of my surroundings. I contacted a security company and installed cameras around the house. Even so, the thought of someone following me for so long and then lingering near my home continued to haunt me. I never saw that car again, but every time I passed a black sedan on the road, my heart would race. I still wonder what they wanted and why they chose to follow me that night. I may never know the answer, but one thing is certain. That incident changed how I approach driving alone at night. Now, every trip home includes a constant check of the rearview mirror. When I returned to campus after Thanksgiving break, everything seemed normal. The late November cold made mornings tougher, but I was ready to dive back into classes and finish the semester. On the first day, as I was leaving my dorm to head to class, I noticed a man standing across the street. He was wearing a heavy coat and a beanie, but something about his posture caught my attention. He seemed distracted, looking down at his phone, but at the same time, he wasn't. I shook my head, thinking I was being paranoid, and went about my day without giving it much thought. The next morning, he was there again, standing in the same spot, staring at my building. This time, I was sure he was watching me. As I walked out, his eyes followed me until I got into my car. My stomach churned. His face wasn't completely unfamiliar. I had seen him once or twice at campus events, but we'd never exchanged more than a simple hi. I tried to brush it off, thinking it might just be a coincidence, but deep down, I already knew something was off. On the third day in a row, when I saw him standing in the exact same place, I decided I needed to do something. That afternoon, I went straight to the campus security office to report what was happening. I explained how the man had been standing outside my dorm every morning and seemed to be watching me. The officer who took my report listened attentively but seemed uncertain. "It does sound suspicious, but he hasn't done anything directly threatening yet," he said, which left me frustrated. Still, they promised to monitor the area and told me to call immediately if I felt unsafe. I tried to convince myself that this would resolve the issue, but the next day he was there again. This time, discomfort turned into real fear. He wasn't just standing there anymore. He had started to act more intrusive. That morning, I found a note stuck to my car windshield. The message was vague, something like, "I enjoyed seeing you today," but the fact that he knew which car was mine made my heart race. It was no longer just the feeling of being watched. It was proof that he was paying close attention to my movements. I went back to the security office, but once again, they said there wasn't much they could do without a direct threat. I walked out feeling invisible, like no one truly understood how terrifying it was to be targeted by someone. Over the next few days, the situation escalated. He was no longer just outside my dorm or leaving notes. I started noticing him in places I frequented regularly. The library, the cafe where I liked to study, even the campus parking lot. He never approached me, but his presence was constant, like a shadow I couldn't escape. Each time I saw him, my heart would race, and I had to fight the urge to run. I mentioned it to some friends. One thought I might be overreacting, but another said something that sent chills down my spine. "If he knows where you live and what car you drive, you're not safe." Finally, I mustered the courage to go to the local police. This time, I brought the notes he had left and described in detail every time I had seen him. The officer who took my report seemed more concerned than the campus security staff, which gave me some relief. They agreed to file a report and promised to patrol the area more frequently. However, when I asked what they could do if he approached me again, the answer was vague. Unless he trespasses or makes explicit threats, it's difficult to take direct action, they said. It was a harsh reality. I knew I had to do more to protect myself, but the sense of helplessness was overwhelming. One night, as I was walking back from the library, I felt that familiar knot in my stomach. I was heading toward the campus parking lot, and the feeling of being watched was almost suffocating. I looked around, and there he was, standing under one of the dimly lit street lamps. This time, he didn't pretend to look away or act like he wasn't watching. He stared at me openly, as if he was waiting for me to notice. Without hesitation, I quickened my pace to my car, locking the doors as soon as I got in. My hands were trembling as I started the engine, and he didn't move. He just stood there, like a statue, watching me drive away. When I got back to my dorm, I knew I couldn't take any more chances. I called the police immediately and reported the latest encounter. To my surprise, they acted quickly. Within a short time, a patrol car arrived on campus, and officers began searching for him. Not long after, I received a call saying they had found him in another area of campus and detained him for questioning. I felt a wave of relief, but that relief turned to terror when I learned he had a history of obsessive behavior toward other women. The police issued a restraining order against him, and the campus increased security around my dorm. Since then, I haven't seen him again, but the fear and paranoia he instilled in me remain. Every step I take in public makes me look over my shoulder, as if his shadow might still be lurking somewhere close by. It was the first time my daughter, Clara, and I were spending Thanksgiving alone. Since the divorce, things hadn't been easy, but we were trying to create new traditions. Clara, at just 7 years old, was excited about the idea of a simple dinner and a movie night. Our house was in a quiet area surrounded by trees, the kind of place most people would find cozy, but on dark nights, it could feel a bit too isolated. That evening, after eating and laughing together, we settled in the living room to watch one of Clara's favorite animated movies. We were about halfway through the movie when we heard the first sound, a soft tap on the living room window. It was so faint at first that I thought I might have imagined it. Clara even commented, "Daddy, I think someone's at the window." I looked outside, but all I could see was darkness and the faint glow of the street lamp. I tried to reassure her, saying it was probably just the wind brushing against the branches. Even so, I closed the curtains, feeling a chill I couldn't quite explain. I thought that would be the end of it, but I had no idea the night was just beginning to take a strange turn. After closing the curtains, I tried to settle back into our routine. Clara seemed a little unsettled but soon got lost in the movie again, laughing at a funny scene. I, on the other hand, couldn't fully relax. That tapping sound lingered in my mind. I decided to get up and check all the doors and windows to make sure they were locked. Everything seemed secure, but the silence outside felt almost oppressive. I forced a smile and returned to the couch, pretending everything was fine. Clara snuggled up next to me, and before the movie even ended, she had fallen asleep. Around 11, I decided it was time to carry her to bed. As I tucked her in, I heard the sound again, a tapping, more insistent this time, like someone deliberately trying to get attention. My heart raced. I laid Clara down carefully, trying not to let my growing fear show. Returning to the living room, I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the curtain just enough to peek outside. Nothing. All I could see was the reflection of the room in the glass and the darkness beyond. I turned off the lights, hoping it would help me see better. That's when my stomach dropped. There were handprints on the window. The sight of those handprints made my pulse race. They weren't just smudges or condensation. They were clear prints, small but distinct, as if someone had pressed their hands against the glass. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe Clara had touched the window earlier, but the clarity of the prints made me doubt that. I turned off the living room lights and stood still, listening. The house was silent, but the wind outside seemed louder, every creak of the trees putting me more on edge. After a few minutes, I decided to check outside. Grabbing the flashlight, I carefully opened the back door. The cold night air hit me, but at first, I didn't see anything unusual. I walked along the side of the house, shining the flashlight as I went. When the beam illuminated the living room window, my stomach churned. There were more handprints, now spread out as if someone had moved along the glass, trying to peer inside from different angles. My instincts screamed at me to go back inside and lock everything up, but I knew I couldn't rest until I figured out who or what was out there. I hurried back inside, locking the door and double-checking all the locks again. I grabbed my phone and considered calling the police, but what could I say? There was no clear evidence of anyone being there, just those eerie prints. I went to check on Clara, who was still sound asleep, blissfully unaware of the growing tension. I stood in her doorway for a moment, listening for any unusual sounds, but all I heard was the wind outside. Back in the living room, I sat on the couch, trying to decide my next move. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the back of the house near the door. It was so subtle it could have been mistaken for the wind, but I knew better. My chest tightened as I grabbed the flashlight again, this time also taking the baseball bat I kept in the closet. I crept to the kitchen, each step heavier than the last. When I shone the flashlight on the back door through the window, I froze. There was a shadow, a low, crouched figure pressed against the side of the house, trying to stay hidden. My breathing grew shallow, and for a moment, I couldn't move. The figure shifted slightly, slow and deliberate, sliding out of view. That mix of fear and urgency snapped me into action. Without hesitation, I called the police, keeping my voice low to avoid alerting whoever was outside. As I spoke with the dispatcher, I heard another sound. A gentle push against the back door, as if someone were testing to see if it was locked. When I finally got through to the dispatcher, I quickly explained what was happening. She assured me a patrol car was on its way and instructed me to stay inside and away from the windows. I followed her advice, but not before grabbing Clara from her bed and bringing her into my room. I locked the door and sat in the dark, holding her close as she slept, listening intently for any sign of movement outside. The wait felt like an eternity, but eventually, I heard the sound of sirens. The flashing lights of the patrol car were a huge relief. I watched through the bedroom window as two officers stepped out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they searched the property. I went to the door to meet them, explaining everything that had happened and showing them the handprints on the windows. They carefully inspected the perimeter, and after a few minutes, one of the officers returned with a grave expression. "We found footprints near the windows and the back door," he said. "They lead into the woods behind your house, but we couldn't find anyone." He also pointed out marks on the ground near the wall, evidence that someone had been crouching there, watching. The thought of someone spending so much time lurking around sent a shiver down my spine. The officers promised to increase patrols in the area and suggested I install security cameras. Before leaving, one of them gave me a serious look. "If anything like this happens again, don't hesitate to call." The next morning, in the daylight, I inspected the outside of the house. The handprints on the windows were clearer than I remembered, and what chilled me even more was noticing that some of them were small, like a child's hands. I never found out who or what had been outside that night, but I immediately reinforced the security of the house. And now, every time I hear a noise at the window, even if it's just the wind, I can't help but glance outside, wondering if someone or something is out there watching again.